Stephen Starr had a front row seat on the uprising in Syria. He's spoken with hundreds of Syrians from all sects and faiths to draw a picture of a country facing unavoidable civil strife. And here's Stephen Starr, author of Revolt in Syria, eyewitness to the uprising, and we're very glad to have you here at TVO.
My pleasure.
How you doing?
Very good, thank you.
You've been in some very dangerous, busy places lately.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, one thing I guess to point out is that the violence is quite localized. It's becoming less so, but certainly when I was there until February of last year, it was quite localized. You could travel around certain parts of the country and be in relative safety. A lot of checkpoints, a lot of traffic and so on, particularly in Damascus. But nothing like you would see or hear what was like happening in Deraa in the south or in Homs in the Midlands.
Well, let me take you back. I want to just go back to sort of spring of 2011 when the protests against Bashar al-Assad's regime began. What was the spark that lit that fuse? The
spark, I mean, there were a couple of different issues. And even, let's go back a little bit before March 2011. There was a drought, a serious drought in the eastern Jazeera part of Syria along the border with Iraq that forced almost 1 million people, farmers and labourers and generally working class people, off the land into the suburbs of the major cities. So let's say the working class suburbs of Aleppo, of Homs, of Deraa, of Damascus. So a lot of these people were forced into the urban areas and took jobs working as taxi drivers. They didn't have very much money, they were quite angry, and they were living on or below the poverty line. They were quite angry with the regime.
So that started something.
Yeah, and simultaneously, in the cities, in the major cities, a lot of new banks, private banks opened up, which allowed people to get loans, which allowed people to get married, which allowed people to buy cars and houses. So in the cities, the urban populations were quite happy with what was happening. But a couple of miles out, in the suburbs, there was a growing kind of anger and that. I guess the main kind of spark was the torture, the detention and torture of a number of young school children in the southern city of Deraa in early March 2011. So these kids wrote some graffiti on a school wall, something they had seen on TV, on Al Jazeera television from Libya, probably Tunisia actually at that stage. And they copied what they saw on TV. So the headmaster took them to the local security station, and they were tortured and detained. Their parents went to the security office looking for their kids. They were told to go home and produce more children. The families, these women and these families, the parents and extended families of these kids demonstrated in the streets. Very, very small demonstration. We're talking mid-March 2011. They were detained. And from there, it really just mushroomed. And
how would you characterize the government's response to those initial protests?
I guess very kind of very blunt and very direct, but in a sense in a very insensitive way, and without actually kind of this around the Arab world you had these revolutions playing out. At the same time, the Syrian regime wasn't able to kind of catch that kind of idea and feel that okay, we need to be a little bit careful here. We can't go back to operating as we usually do.
There were some concessions, if I remember, initially to these original protests. What kind of concessions was the government prepared to make?
Yeah, I mean, there was amendments made to the constitution. There was talks of new electoral laws. There was talks of the end of the state of emergency that had been in play for decades because of the war with Israel.
But nothing enough to deter the protests.
In reality, the reality was quite different. At the same time, they were shooting dead protesters in Homs, in Deraa. They were detaining thousands of demonstrators and young people across the country. So if you watch Syrian state television, you could see the regime and government was making all these reforms and answering to the people's wishes. But if you went to these towns on Friday afternoons, after they left mosques, it was a very, very different reality at play.
Well, how was it that in the countryside, government troops were gunning down people, while at the same time in Damascus, there were thousands of people in the streets championing Assad's regime?
Very, very good points. Something that we don't hear about is the strength and the power of the regime's propaganda machine. This is something that we have no handle on here, at least in the English language media. It's very, very pervasive. So let's say, for example, someone wakes up in the morning, they turn on Syrian TV and they see that everything is good, that there's these small problems in Deraa, but at the same time the government is enacting reforms and that, increasing salaries, and everything is great. And let's say your average Syrian gets in his car or in his bus to go to work, and on the radio it's the same message, and he's driving along the highway, and you have all these signs and billboards saying that Bashar is with us. With freedom comes responsibility was one that played around especially around Damascus.
Sounds like a quote from a Spider-Man movie. But anyway,
there was an incredible sense of of an Orwellian kind of state taking over, and you had this massive outpouring, as you said, of support for the regime. And a question I asked a lot of people at that time, at least, was why now? Why is all this this outward support for the regime, for Bashar specifically? Why now? What's the reason? And I never actually got a satisfactory answer.
Okay, but then what turned everything from demonstrating in the streets against the regime to we're going to take up arms and we're going to try and overthrow this government?
Yeah. Well, they were forced. They were forced to, because when they went, the only way the protesters could defend themselves was to use arms. And for the most part, I think we need to differentiate a little bit between protesters and the armed insurrection. Okay. The first, I guess, major armed kind of group was based in Homs, in a place called Bab Amr, which we know today, I guess, as being it has been utterly destroyed by the regime's shelling. And a group of regime soldiers defected and went to this area, which was sympathetic to the opposition's point of view, and they wanted the regime to fall. So this was the very first kind of fighting between the government side and rebels.
Where'd they get their arms from?
A lot of it was taken, they took with them. A lot of the time you had kind of soldiers sympathetic to the opposition and to the rebels, that they would sneak out guns. This is kind of going back to I guess, December 2011, or the first kind of 9 or 10 months of the revolution.
Can you tell, Stephen, how much the events in Tunisia or Egypt, or I guess even more recently than that in Libya, were influential on what happened in Syria?
There was certainly a sense that there was change in the Arab world, that people wanted to kind of take their futures into their own hand, that they didn't want to be directed in every facet of their daily lives. There's obviously large young populations across the Arab world with little prospects with what from their own point of view. So that was certainly an issue. But I think we need to be careful in that kind of that we group all these countries together, because there are very different dynamics at play. As I said, this drought forced almost 1 million people to the urban areas. Mm-hmm. To the exact urban areas, these poor working class areas of the major cities, that were the first places to demonstrate.
Okay, let's see if we can get inside Syria a little more. You lived there for how long?
About 5 years.
5 years. Yeah. Take us inside society and tell us, beyond the torturing of the kids, which obviously is appalling, what are the main grievances against the Assad regime?
There are various grievances, I guess. I'll give you an example. The state sector in Syria is huge. It employs millions and millions of people. Your average state public sector employee gets paid about $200 a month. So they have very little room to play with in terms of buying clothes, or in terms of any kind of enjoyment, extracurricular activities and that. They're bused to and from their work every day. The state provides them with some heating gas and some heating fuel even every winter. So the state's very much central to their everyday lives. And
their everyday lives sound pretty grim.
They are pretty grim. It's almost a sense that there's very little you can do on $200 a month. Obviously it's the standard of living, or the expense of living, is quite different from here. It's quite less, or quite cheaper even. But people felt like they were kind of caught in a bind almost.
So then where does this guy's support come from?
At the same time, you had, as I said, this expansion of the private sector, that you had 13 new private banks open up. You had a new media sector open up, a lot of kind of private kind of organizations. There was a lot of tourism actually growing across the country. 2010, I think they had exceeded the expectations of revenue that they would get from tourism. So on one level, you had this kind of, people were very much enjoying life, particularly, as I said, these middle class families, families that had jobs where they were earning, private sector salaries. They had means to pay off loans, and they could get married. And in Syrian society, you need to have a house, and preferably a car if you want to get married. So people could go to the banks, get loans for a car and for a house, and get married. And they were quite happy with this. They would go to the restaurants on weekends.
And they tend to support the regime.
And they were happy with where they were, yes.
Now, he's an Alawite, right?
Yep.
And they're what percentage of Syrian society?
10 to 12%. It's debatable exactly.
So
we don't exactly.
are there enough people who could have been content with the status quo that a guy who really only represents 10% of the population can stay in there?
Yeah, it's not only sectarian. As I say, we have, the populations of Damascus and Aleppo make up about a third of the entire population of the country. And you had these people who were happy in the status quo, that they didn't want to rock the boat too much. They had their jobs, they had their, they could holiday in Turkey once a year. They could go to restaurants every night as they wished. They had a car, and life was quite good. Their kids were, in good schools, and there was a sense of kind of achievement even for a lot of these people. And it's not just the Alawite sect that support the regime. You have about a quarter of the entire population is made up of other minorities. So you're talking Christians and Druze and
who are also
Shias
somewhat supportive, eh?
Yeah, it's supportive to the extent that they fear an Islamist revolution or an Islamist kind of government taking over. They fear the Saudi style or Iran style.
So the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
More or less.
In that respect. I tell you, there's one story you told in the book, and I can't remember who you had it with. When I mention this, you'll remind me. Who said the one thing that Syria really needs right now is a unifying cause to bring all of these disparate groups together. And he said nothing would do that better than going to war with Israel. Now, first of all, where does that idea come from? That it's a great unifying cause to invade one of your neighbors?
Because you have for 40 years this propaganda in every facet of people's lives that says, Israel is the enemy, America is supporting Israel, that Israel has occupied the Golan Heights, which it has.
And annexed them.
And annexed them, a very important part of Syrian territory in terms of access to water and that. So it's quite easy to motivate a population to do so. Now, of course, that guy he was a Shia Muslim. His opinion doesn't represent that of all Syrians. But another kind of point, I guess, is that Hezbollah is quite popular in Syria, and particularly amongst Syria's Shia population. Hezbollah is a Shia group itself, and Hezbollah is at war with Israel.
But Syria is not, and hasn't been for a long time.
Well, it has been technically they're in a state of war. Yeah,
okay.
But
they haven't had a shot fired across that border in
absolutely.
decades.
Israel's quietest border has been the Golan Heights with Syria,
which is pretty ironic, except for the time when Israel, I guess, put a plane in the sky and dropped a bomb inside Syria, which everybody hushed up.
Exactly.
But the question is there much support inside Syria among the man and woman in the street for a war with Israel?
No, I don't think so. Very little. This guy was speaking from his own sectarian background perspective. Okay.
What phrase, in your view, best describes the nature of the uprising now? Is this an Islamic coup? Is it a sectarian uprising? Is it a class revolt? What gets closest?
I guess the class revolt is probably closest, seeing as how things have played out. There is a very small percentage of the actual revolution itself has an Islamist trend to it, I suppose. The major cities still haven't revolted. Now, there have been, obviously, in Aleppo in the north, a lot of fighting there. But the rebels that instigated the fighting in Aleppo are not from Aleppo city itself. They're from the countryside. As I say, they are these people who were formerly farmers and that are very much upset with the regime. They took the fight to Aleppo. And the reason the rebels have not been able to take Aleppo, and to a lesser extent Damascus, is because there is no kind of indigenous support there. So when the rebels came to certain areas of Aleppo, and to be fair, there had been demonstrations in these areas, when the rebels got to these areas, the local populations left. There was no support for them. They weren't able to get food, or they weren't able to move around easily. They had no intelligence. And as a result, the regime was able to shell and bomb and carry out airstrikes against them. And this is why we're at this kind of stage where neither side can overwhelm the other.
How much desire did you pick up from the population for external or international intervention in what's going on there?
It really depends who you speak to. If you speak to a well-to-do Damascene man or woman, they will say that, we don't like the regime, but the alternative is so much worse for us. We don't want any foreign intervention, and we fear that if America, for example, gets involved, or NATO or Turkey gets involved, things will get so much worse in Syria.
Worse. There's 60,000 people dead. What could be much worse?
No, I agree with that point. But this is their point of view. If you speak to the father or mother of a from Dera or from Homs who has lost a family member, has had family members tortured or friends or neighbours been killed by the regime's actions, they have a very, very different perspective. They will say, we want NATO intervention today. We want a no-fly zone as soon as possible. We want America to do all it can to get involved in overthrowing the regime. So
they want boots on the ground. They want Iraq-style invasion.
Anything to take the Assad regime out.
Huh. Let me quote here from Paul Wolfowitz, who writes in the Wall Street Journal just from a couple of days ago the following. I'll get comfortable. This is a little bit long, and then I'll get you to comment on this. The U.S. failure to provide weapons, training, or even medical support to the Syrian opposition is yielding the very consequences that U.S. officials claimed would flow from outside intervention. It has helped prolong the conflict, which has now left some 60,000 dead and some 2 million displaced. It has also enabled extremist fighters, armed by fundamentalist Persian Gulf governments, and even elements directly linked to al-Qaeda, to gain a growing and perhaps dominant role in the opposition. Where the Syrian opposition started out openly hostile to Russia, China, and Iran, the U.S. failure to offer anything except empty rhetoric has caused deep resentment among previously friendly Syrians. U.S. inaction may in fact have produced a situation in which a post-Assad Syria will be intensely anti-American, perhaps even dominated by extremists. The outcome that some feared would be the result of American action may instead result from American inaction. Is he onto something here?
I think he is onto something. I think we need to pick apart different points of what he's making there. The Obama doctrine has been, in terms of foreign affairs, has been not to get involved. He got elected on the point that he was pulling troops out of Iraq, that he was winding down the war in Afghanistan. He was kind of pulled reluctantly, I believe, into the intervention in Libya, and the intervention in Libya is a much more straightforward situation than a potential intervention in Syria for a number of reasons. I'm not sure it's quite fair to put all the blame on the American administration right now. Turkey has a very well-equipped army, but Turkey is very much afraid of getting involved in getting bogged down in some kind of a long-term kind of war inside Syria. And both countries and both regimes even share this Kurdish issue as well that they're quite fearful of. But the Turkish government won't move unless it's got direct backing from NATO, and direct backing in NATO comes from the US.
Well, Wolfowitz's track record is somewhat suspect. He was a big fan of the Iraq invasion, and that didn't turn out too well for the United States in the short run. We'll see what history says 50 years from now. But is there an argument to be made here that America ought to be much more directly involved in this thing, lest post-Assad Syria turns its back even more vigorously on America?
Yeah, the American government at least has never been popular amongst the Syrian population, and nor certainly is the Russian government been popular amongst the kind of the opposition elements, or those who oppose the regime or support the revolution. It's difficult to say. We say America should get involved. What should America do? This growing Islamist element is obviously something that has made the U.S. administration very fearful. If they want to hand out anti-aircraft weapons, they don't know who it's going to.
How about a no-fly zone?
A no-fly zone. Well, I think personally that's what it should come to. As you say, 60,000 people have died. How much worse can it actually get? The country's entire social fabric has been shredded to pieces.
Let me quote something from your book now. Many Damascenes dream of the old, as of course people from Damascus, many Damascenes dream of the old days. They hold the regime in contempt but desire regular electricity supply, stable prices, and normality more than their freedom that their countrymen fight for both north and south of them. Syria seems set for months and perhaps years of economic stagnation, brutal repression, and divisions. Do you think revolt fatigue, if I can call it that, has helped or hurt the Assad regime?
I think it's helped the Assad regime, certainly. It's very difficult to think about what political direction your country should take when you can't cook for your kids, when you can't make it out to the shops because you can't get fuel, you can't get gas for your car. There's no electricity in your house. It's freezing cold. So in terms of what their political direction or what solution should come to the crisis, as they call it in Damascus, they don't call it a revolt. or a war or a conflict in Damascus for the most part. They call it a crisis. So it's very difficult to think about these kind of ideas and ideals of what political solution there should be. Should Russia get involved? Should America get involved? When you're faced with this direct and imminent, these direct and imminent issues, you're afraid that if you send your son off to get tomatoes, is he going to make it back? Will he be robbed? Will there be an airstrike? Will he get through the checkpoints? All these issues, these are the things that trouble the Syrians and Damascenes today.
Okay, in our last minute here, everybody, and I mean everybody, is predicting an end to this regime. They're just saying it's a matter of time. Some people think it's going to happen in days or weeks. I want to know from you, do you think he's done?
He is done. Certainly the regime is done in its current form. Things cannot go back to the way they were.
But can he hold on and stay in power?
He can possibly hold on to some parts of the country. It's likely he will pull back to the coastal mountains where there's a large Alawite population and possibly carry on some kind of a insurgent war from there.
You want to put a time limit on it?
Probably by the summer.
By the summer?
I think, yeah.
He's beat all the predictions so far. A lot of people thought he'd be out by now.
Yeah, that's right.
Stephen, we're really glad you came in today and shared your stories of the revolt in Syria, eyewitness to the uprising. Stephen Starr, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.